The silence was the first thing they mocked. Not the loud, defiant silence of a petulant child, but a silence so profound it seemed to absorb sound, a tiny personal gravity well in the opulent dining room of Ethelgard. In that well sat 8-year-old Lily Finch, her world contained in the perfect geometric arrangement of her silverware on the starched linen tablecloth. Fork, knife, spoon, water glass, each held its precise position, a bastion against the chaos of the clinking crystal and murmured conversations that filled the grand restaurant. Her father, Alistair Finch, did not notice. He saw the restaurant not as a space for sensory experience, but as a map of power. At that table sat the venture capitalist who could fund his new biotech wing. Over there, the city councilman whose zoning variance he required. His daughter was merely a pawn in a game he was playing with his ex-wife, a court-mandated dinner to prove his parental engagement. He spoke into his phone, his voice a low, serrated edge, carving up markets and chewing through quarterly reports. The words leveraged buyout and hostile takeover were more familiar on his tongue than any lullaby. Clara Evans noticed everything. At 22, she was a ghost in this world of wealth, her black and white uniform a cloak of invisibility. But ghosts see more than the living. She saw the tremor in Lily's small hands as she nudged her fork a millimeter to the left. She saw the girl's eyes, a pale, watery blue, flit nervously toward a nearby table where a new party was being seated. Clara saw the tension in the child's shoulders, the way she pleated the napkin in her lap into a tiny, perfect accordion. These were not the signs of a spoiled child being difficult. Clara, in the second year of her nursing degree with a focus on pediatric developmental disorders, recognized them as the subtle tells of a soul in distress. She had spent hours in clinicals learning to read the language of the nonverbal, to understand the fortress of ritual that children with sensory processing disorders build to protect themselves from a world that is too loud, too bright, too much. The new arrivals were a blast of noise and expensive perfume, a woman with a surgically taut face, a man with a booming laugh, and their 2 teenage daughters, Madison and Chloe, who moved with the languid, predatory entitlement of those who have never been told no. They were seated at the adjacent table, close enough that Lily flinched as Madison's chair scraped the polished floor. "Oh my God, look at that weirdo!" Madison hissed to her sister, her voice a stage whisper designed to carry. She gestured with a flick of her gel-manicured nails. "She's been playing with her silverware for 10 minutes. Is she, like, simple?" Chloe snickered, a high, piercing sound. "Probably. Daddy says some of these new money types have defective kids." Alistair Finch, 3 feet away, heard nothing, his entire being focused on the voice in his ear talking about a 2.3% drop in Asian markets. He frowned, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed silver and black hair, oblivious to the small-scale cruelty unfolding beside him. Clara felt a hot spike of anger in her chest. She had seen this before, the casual disdain, the easy mockery. But here, in the hushed cathedral of Ethelgard, where a single plate cost more than her week's rent, it felt particularly profane. Her manager, Monsieur Dubois, a man who worshipped at the altar of Michelin stars and discretion, had a zero-tolerance policy for staff interfering with guests. Her tuition payment was due next week. She had exactly $87.54 in her checking account. Losing this job wasn't an option. It was a catastrophe. She forced herself to breathe, to move, to pour water for another table, her eyes never leaving the tableau. Madison was getting bolder. She leaned over, her voice syrupy sweet. "Hi there. What's your name? Cat got your tongue?" Lily didn't respond. Her focus narrowed entirely on the spoon. It was her anchor. The polished silver reflected the chandeliers in a distorted, manageable way. It was cool and smooth and predictable. Madison smirked, then deliberately reached out and nudged the spoon, breaking the perfect alignment. It was a small act, a tiny violation, but to Lily it was an earthquake. The child's meticulously constructed dam of control shattered. A low guttural sound, a half-sob, half-gasp, escaped her lips. Her hands flew up to her ears and she began to rock, a frantic, rhythmic motion that was the only release for the surge of overwhelming panic. Alistair finally looked up, his phone call ending. He saw his daughter's distress, the other table's amused stares, and the approaching waitress. Annoyance flashed across his face. A scene. He hated scenes. "Lily, stop it," he commanded, his voice sharp with embarrassment. "Sit still. People are looking." But Lily couldn't stop. The world was spinning. The lights were stabbing at her eyes. The spoon was wrong. Madison and Chloe were now laughing openly. "Total freak show," Chloe muttered. That was it. The tuition, the rent, Monsieur Dubois, they all vanished from Clara's mind, replaced by the image of a terrified child being publicly tormented, while her own father admonished her for it. The nurse in her, the part that had chosen a life of advocacy and care, eclipsed the waitress entirely. She walked to Lily's side, ignoring Alistair's furious glare. She knelt down, bringing herself to the child's eye level, creating a small human shield between Lily and the mocking girls. She didn't touch her. That would only add to the sensory overload. Instead, she spoke in a low, calm, even tone, the voice she used with frightened children in the emergency room. "My name is Clara," she said softly, her gaze focused only on Lily. "I see your spoon moved. That's very frustrating when you've worked so hard to get it just right. Let's fix it together." She slowly reached out, her movements deliberate and telegraphed, and gently picked up the spoon. She held it for a moment, then placed it back exactly where it had been, aligning its edge with the crease in the tablecloth. She then took the bread knife and adjusted it a fraction of an inch, making the geometry even more perfect than before. Lily's rocking slowed. Her hands lowered from her ears. She looked at Clara, and in her wide, frightened eyes there was a flicker of dawning recognition. This person understood. Clara remained kneeling for another moment, then stood up, her entire demeanor transforming. The gentle nurse vanished, and a woman of cold, quiet fury took her place. She turned to face Madison and Chloe, her expression unreadable, but her eyes burning with an intensity that made both girls shrink back in their velvet chairs. "What you have just done," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper, but cutting through the restaurant's murmur, "is not just unkind. It is a deliberate act of cruelty against a child who has done nothing to you. Your amusement came at the expense of her peace and her safety. That is the definition of a bully." The girl's mother gasped, clutching her pearls. "How dare you? Do you have any idea who we are?" "I know what you are," Clara replied, her voice still low but now laced with steel. "You are guests in a public establishment, and your behavior is unacceptable. You have disturbed another guest and caused significant distress. I am asking you to apologize to the child." "Apologize?" Madison shrieked, her face turning a blotchy red. "To her? She's the one making a scene. We want to speak to your manager. You're fired." From the corner of her eye, Clara saw Monsieur Dubois gliding towards them, his face a mask of controlled horror. Her career at Ethelgard was over. She knew it. But as she looked back at Lily, who was now sitting perfectly still, her hands in her lap, watching Clara with a look of utter awe, she felt no regret. Only a fierce, protective pride. But she had miscalculated the immediate threat. It wasn't the entitled mother or the sneering manager who held her fate in his hands. It was the billionaire father who had been watching the entire exchange with a thunderous expression. Alistair Finch rose to his full height, his bespoke suit doing little to conceal the raw power coiled in his frame. He didn't look at Madison or her family. He didn't look at Monsieur Dubois. He looked directly at Clara, and the look in his eyes was not gratitude. It was pure, unadulterated rage. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he snarled, his voice a low growl that promised retribution. "You have just made my daughter the center of a spectacle. You brought more attention to her, embarrassed me. You are fired. Get out of my sight." The words hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. Fired. Not by the manager, but by the man whose child she had just defended. He hadn't seen the instigation. He hadn't understood the silent language of his own daughter's pain. He had only seen a low-level employee creating a scene, and in his world, scenes were liabilities to be neutralized. Monsieur Dubois arrived, his face pale. "Mr. Finch, I am so terribly sorry for this disturbance. Mademoiselle Evans, you will come with me, immediately." Clara stood frozen for a second, Caught between the manager's command and the billionaire's fury, she looked from Alistair's cold, unforgiving face to Lily's. The little girl's brief moment of awe had collapsed back into fear. Her gaze darted between her father and Clara, her small body tense. She had seen her defender, her momentary champion, struck down by the most powerful person in her own universe. The message was clear. No one could stand up to her father, not even for her. The other family, the architects of the cruelty, were preening in their victory. Madison shot Clara a triumphant smirk. "Told you," she mouthed silently. Her mother was already complaining loudly to Dubois about the appalling lack of professionalism. Clara felt a wave of despair wash over her. It wasn't just about the job, the money, the tuition. It was the crushing injustice. She had done the right thing, the only thing a decent human being could do, and she was being punished for it. The bullies were being placated, and the victim's father was their chief enabler. "Sir," Clara started, her voice shaking slightly, trying to appeal to the man who was now turning his back on her. "Please, you don't understand. Those girls were tormenting her. I understand perfectly." Alistair cut her off without turning around, his voice like chipping ice. "I understand that my private family dinner has been turned into a public melodrama by an overstepping waitress. Dubois, I expect her to be gone before my dessert arrives." Dubois took Clara's arm in a firm grip. "This way, mademoiselle." He led her away from the table, past the gawking diners, the whispers following them like a trail of smoke. Clara didn't resist. The fight had gone out of her. As she was steered toward the swinging doors of the kitchen, she risked one last look back. Alistair was sitting down, smoothing his tie, his face a mask of rigid control. He picked up the menu, a clear signal that the incident was over, a piece of unpleasantness to be dismissed. He didn't look at his daughter, but Lily was looking at Clara. Her pale blue eyes were filled with an expression Clara couldn't quite decipher. It was more than fear, more than sadness. It was a look of profound, soul-deep resignation, the look of a child who had just had her last sliver of hope extinguished. Lily then did something Clara would never forget. She slowly, deliberately reached out and pushed her perfectly aligned spoon a single, discordant inch out of place. It was an act of silent protest, an act of solidarity, and her father, once again, did not notice. Back in the cacophony of the kitchen, amidst the clatter of pans and the barked orders of the chef, Monsieur Dubois rounded on her. His usual Gallic charm had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hard fury. "Are you insane?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "Do you know who that was? That was Alistair Finch. His check from one dinner could pay your salary for a year. And the other family? That is Marcus Thorne, a senior partner at Blackwood Capital. They could buy this restaurant and turn it into a parking garage on a whim." "They were torturing a child," Clara said, her voice numb. "A special needs child." "They are patrons," Dubois retorted, jabbing a finger at her chest. "Your job is to pour their wine, take their order, and remain invisible. It is not to play social justice warrior and dispense moral lessons. You are a waitress, not a therapist." "I'm a nursing student," Clara corrected him quietly, a pointless act of self-defense. "I know what I saw. That little girl was having a severe anxiety attack triggered by their bullying." "I don't care if you are studying to be an astronaut," he snapped. "At Ethelgard, you are staff. You are disposable. Get your things from your locker. You have 5 minutes to be out of this building. I will have your final check mailed to you." The finality of his words was absolute. There was no appeal, no hearing, just exile. She walked in a daze to the cramped staff locker room in the basement, the smell of bleach and old grease clinging to the air. She changed out of her uniform, the crisp black and white fabric suddenly feeling like a costume from a life that was no longer hers. As she packed her few belongings into her worn backpack, a textbook on pediatric neurology, a half-eaten granola bar, her phone, the full weight of her situation crashed down on her. How was she going to pay her rent? How was she going to pay for the next semester? Her part-time library job barely covered her food. This job, with its rare but substantial tips from the city's elite, was her lifeline. A lifeline she had severed for a child whose own father didn't even seem to care. A bitter, hollow feeling filled her chest. Had she been a fool? Had her principles just cost her her future? Meanwhile, back in the dining room, an uneasy quiet had settled over Alistair Finch's table. The Thorne family, having achieved their objective, had turned back to their own conversation, though Madison kept shooting smug glances in their direction. Alistair was trying to regain control, to pretend the last 10 minutes hadn't happened. "So," he said, forcing a brisk tone as he looked at the dessert menu. "What looks good, Lily? The chocolate lava cake? The raspberry sorbet?" Lily didn't answer. She was staring at the space where Clara had knelt. Her spoon was still out of alignment, a small monument to her defiance. "Lily, I'm speaking to you," Alistair said, his patience fraying. The merger call had been stressful, the dinner was a legal obligation, and now this public humiliation. He just wanted the evening to be over. "Choose a dessert so we can go." Still, she said nothing. She simply picked up her water glass, her small hand trembling slightly, and tilted it. A stream of ice-cold water poured onto the pristine tablecloth, spreading in a dark, ever-widening circle, soaking the linen and dripping silently onto the plush carpet below. It was a quiet, deliberate act of rebellion, an act of grief, an act of rage that her silent world could not give voice to in any other way. Alistair stared, dumbfounded. Lily had never done anything like this before. She was meticulous, orderly, almost obsessively neat. This was so out of character, it was like watching a statue weep. The carefully constructed image of a successful father having a pleasant dinner with his daughter was now, quite literally, dissolving in front of him. "What on earth?" he began, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the spreading stain, at his daughter's blank, distant expression, and for the first time that evening, a sliver of doubt pierced his armor of certainty. He had assumed he knew the situation, had managed it by removing the disruptive element, the waitress, but the disruption wasn't gone. It was sitting right across from him, and he suddenly had the terrifying feeling that he didn't understand what was happening at all. The spilled water was a breach in the dam. Alistair Finch, a man who managed billion-dollar crises before breakfast, was completely wrong-footed by a puddle on a tablecloth. He stared at his daughter, truly looked at her for the first time since they'd sat down. Her face was pale and still, but her eyes, fixed on the spreading stain, held a storm of emotions he couldn't begin to name. "Waiter!" he called out, his voice sharper than he intended. A different server, a young man with terrified eyes, scurried over. "Clean this up, and bring the check." The pretense of a pleasant family meal was over. He just wanted out. As the staff rushed to change the tablecloth, with practiced, silent efficiency, Alistair tried to process the last 20 minutes. His primary emotion was still a deep, burning embarrassment. The scene, the stares, the Thorne family of all people. Marcus Thorne sat on the board of a company Alistair was trying to acquire. This dinner would be gossip in the boardroom by morning. Finch can't even control his own kid. His anger at the waitress, Clara, solidified. She had escalated it. A quiet word with her manager would have sufficed. Instead, she'd played the righteous hero, turning a minor annoyance into a full-blown spectacle and putting his daughter's vulnerability on public display. He felt a grim satisfaction in having her fired. It was a swift, clean solution. But the image of Lily pouring the water haunted him. It was an act of profound something, not mischief, not clumsiness. It was an act of communication. He just didn't speak the language. The ride home in the back of his chauffeured Maybach was thick with a silence even heavier than Lily's usual state. She sat pressed against the far door, staring out at the blurred city lights, her small frame rigid. Alistair sat with his arms crossed, staring at the back of the driver's head. The silence felt accusatory. When they arrived at his sterile, minimalist penthouse apartment, Lily walked straight to her room without a glance in his direction. There was no good-night hug, not that there often was, but tonight the absence of it felt like a slammed door. Alistair poured himself a 3-finger glass of Macallan 25, the amber liquid doing little to soothe the knot of unease in his stomach. He paced his living room, the panoramic view of the glittering city skyline offering no comfort. He had won. He had asserted his authority, removed the problem, and put the Thorne family in their place by simply ignoring their petty drama. So why did it feel so much like a loss? His phone buzzed. It was a text from his ex-wife, Catherine. How was dinner with Lily? He typed a response. Fine. It was a lie, and they both knew it. He deleted it. He typed another. There was a bit of a scene. Too vague. It invited questions he didn't want to answer. Finally, he settled on, "She's in her room. Seemed tired." He hated the cowardice in the words. An hour later, unable to settle, he found himself outside Lily's bedroom door. It was slightly ajar. He pushed it open gently. The room was dark except for the glow of a single desk lamp. Lily was not in bed. She was sitting at her small white desk, her back to him. On her desk was an intricate world in miniature. She built dioramas, a hobby he'd paid for but never paid attention to. Tiny, perfectly crafted scenes. Tonight she was working on a new one. In the center was a miniature restaurant table, complete with tiny forks and spoons. There were 4 figures at the table, a man in a suit, a small girl, and 2 other figures across from them. One of the figures, a girl with blonde hair, was pushing over another, smaller figure, a waitress doll. The man in the suit was looking at his phone. Alistair's breath caught in his throat. It was the entire evening, laid out in stark, silent testimony. The details were what stunned him. The angle of the fallen waitress doll, the phone in the father figure's hand. He moved closer and saw what Lily was holding. It was the little girl doll from the diorama. With a pair of tiny tweezers, she was carefully placing a single glistening drop of clear glue on the doll's cheek. A tear. The sight broke through his defenses. The anger, the embarrassment, the pride. It all crumbled away, leaving a raw, hollow ache of shame. He hadn't just missed the bullying. He had punished the only person who had tried to help. He had looked at a protector and seen an antagonist. He had validated the cruelty of the bullies and invalidated his own daughter's pain. The waitress hadn't made Lily the center of a spectacle. She had entered the spectacle that was already underway and tried to end it. He backed out of the room, his heart pounding. He went to his home office, the one that looked like a command center for a small country, and pulled up the encrypted email from his head of security. As a man of his stature, he had a standing request for a summary of any public incidents. He knew there would be a report, complete with security footage. He hadn't planned on watching it, content in his own version of events. Now he had to see. He clicked the file. The video feed from Ethelgard's dining room was crisp and clear, though silent. He fast-forwarded to their arrival. He watched himself immediately take a business call. He saw his own distraction, his patent disinterest. He watched the Thorne family arrive. He saw Madison's sneer, her whispered comments, Chloe's laughter. He saw it all, every cruel gesture, every mocking look. Then he saw Clara. He watched her notice the situation from across the room. He saw the conflict on her face. He saw her choose to act. He watched her kneel by Lily, her movements gentle and reassuring. He saw her fix the spoon. He saw his daughter's rocking cease, saw the brief, wondrous look of relief on her face. Then he watched the confrontation. He saw Clara stand up to the Thorne family, her posture radiating a calm authority he had completely missed in the heat of the moment. And then he saw himself. He saw himself rise, his face a mask of fury, and point a finger at this young woman who had done nothing but protect his child. He saw her flinch. He saw the hope drain from his daughter's eyes. The video was irrefutable. It was a complete, damning indictment of his own blindness. The cold knot of unease in his stomach twisted into a sickening feeling of self-loathing. He had failed. In the most fundamental way a father could fail, he had failed. He hadn't protected his child. He had protected his pride. He minimized the video and stared at the name on the incident report. Clara Evans, terminated. He had to fix this, but how? An apology felt insultingly inadequate. Money felt like a bribe. He had used his power to ruin this young woman's evening and likely her immediate future. Now he would have to use that same power to make it right. But it wouldn't be easy. He hadn't just fired a waitress. He had fired a witness to his own monumental failure as a father, and finding her, let alone earning her forgiveness, was going to be a battle he wasn't sure he knew how to win. The first step was finding her. It proved more difficult than Alistair had anticipated. Ethelgard, citing employee privacy policies and likely a deep-seated fear of him, refused to provide her contact information. He had to delegate the task to his head of security, a former MI6 agent named Thompson, who could find a ghost in a fog bank. While Thompson worked his discreet magic, Alistair was left to navigate the wreckage of his own making. The next morning, he canceled all his meetings, an unprecedented event that sent ripples of panic through his company. He sat in his vast, silent kitchen and tried to make Lily pancakes from a box mix. He burned the first batch, and the second was rubbery. Lily came out of her room, dressed for her specialized school, and looked at the sad, lopsided pancakes on the plate he offered. She didn't say a word, but she picked up a fork and ate 2 bites, a gesture of conciliation that felt more profound to Alistair than any signed contract. "Lily," he started, his voice rusty. "About last night, I was wrong. I didn't see what was happening. That young woman, the waitress, she was helping you, and I punished her for it. I am sorry." Lily looked at him, her expression unreadable. She pushed a piece of pancake around her plate, then looked up and met his eyes for a fleeting second. It was enough. It was an invitation to keep trying. By noon, Thompson reported back. Clara Evans was 22, an orphan, putting herself through the city's top nursing program with a combination of scholarships, loans, and 2 low-wage jobs. She lived in a rundown walk-up apartment in a neighborhood Alistair's car was programmed to avoid. Her financial situation, Thompson noted dryly, was precarious. The word twisted in Alistair's gut. He had single-handedly kicked the legs out from under her already shaky foundation. He drove himself. Taking the Maybach felt obscene. He parked his understated but still ridiculously expensive Tesla down the block and walked to the building. The lobby smelled of damp and boiled cabbage. He climbed 4 flights of stairs, the threadbare carpet worn down to the wood. He knocked on apartment 4B. The door opened a few inches, held by a chain. A sliver of Clara's face appeared, her eyes wide with suspicion, then recognition, then a cold, shuttered hostility. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice flat. "Miss Evans," he began, feeling a nervousness he hadn't felt since his first hostile takeover bid. "My name is Alistair Finch. We met last night. May I have a moment of your time?" "You fired me last night. I think we're done," she said, and began to close the door. "Please," he said, the word feeling foreign and clumsy in his mouth. "I came to apologize. I was wrong. Completely and inexcusably wrong." She paused, her hand on the door. He could see the sound of the kitchen doors swinging shut behind her was a final, percussive end to a life. One moment, Clara Evans was a ghost in a cathedral of wealth. The next, she was in exile, cast out into the humid, indifferent city night. The clatter of Ethelgard faded, replaced by the symphony of the street, the hiss of a bus's air brakes, the distant wail of a siren, the rhythmic bass spilling from a passing car. She walked, not towards the subway, but aimlessly, her worn backpack a meager weight against the crushing immensity of her failure. Each step on the cracked pavement was a self-recrimination. You knew the rules. You knew what would happen. Monsieur Dubois' venomous whisper echoed in her ears, a counterpoint to Alistair Finch's icy dismissal. "You are disposable." The words were meant to wound, and they had. They had found the deepest insecurity of a young woman who had spent her life clinging to the edges of other people's worlds and twisted the knife. She had traded her future, her tuition, her rent, the precarious stability she had clawed for a single fleeting moment of righteous defiance. And for what? For a little girl whose own father had looked at her, Clara, not as a rescuer, but as a problem to be eliminated. He hadn't seen the heroism. He'd seen a disruption to his dinner. He hadn't seen his daughter's silent plea for help. He'd seen a flaw in his perfectly curated public image. The bitterest pill was the realization that in her attempt to shield Lily, she had only succeeded in reinforcing the child's most terrifying lesson, that her pain was an inconvenience, and anyone who acknowledged it would be punished. The image of Lily's face, that brief flicker of awe collapsing back into resigned fear, was seared into Clara's mind. That look would haunt her far longer than the overdue rent notice she knew was taped to her apartment door. She finally reached her walk-up, the air in the stairwell thick with the smells of a dozen struggling lives. She unlocked the 3 locks on her door and stepped into her tiny sanctuary. It was more library than living space. Stacks of textbooks on neurology and pediatric psychology formed canyons on her floor. Diagrams of the brachial plexus and the circle of Willis were taped to the peeling paint of the walls. This room was her entire ambition, the physical manifestation of her dream to trade her waitress uniform for scrubs, to move from serving the privileged to healing the vulnerable. Tonight, it felt like a mausoleum for a future that had just died. She sank onto her lumpy mattress, not bothering to turn on a light. The city glowed through her single window, casting long shadows that looked like grasping fingers. She didn't cry. The exhaustion was too deep, the despair too cold. She had stood on a principle, and the principle had broken her. As sleep finally pulled her under, her last conscious thought was not of anger, but of a profound, aching sorrow for a silent little girl who had deliberately pushed her own spoon out of place, a tiny, hopeless act of rebellion in a world determined to keep her perfectly, painfully, in line. Alistair Finch did not sleep. The Macallan 25 did nothing but sharpen the edges of his shame. He sat in the command center of his home office. The silent, panoramic city lights a mocking reflection of his own inner darkness. On one of his 8 monitors, the security footage from Ethelgard was paused on a single, crystalline image. Clara Evans, kneeling, her face softened with a gentle focus that was almost maternal, as she moved Lily's spoon back into its perfect position. On another monitor, a different image. His own face contorted with a cold, dismissive rage as he uttered the words that had shattered the moment. He was a man who traded in narratives. He constructed them for his investors, for the media, for his board of directors. The narrative of Alistair Finch was one of ruthless efficiency, of visionary foresight, of unflinching control. He had always been the protagonist of his own story, but the unblinking, objective eye of the camera had revealed the truth. In this story, the only one that truly mattered, he was the villain. He had not merely failed to protect his daughter. He had actively sided with her tormentors. He had seen a threat not in the sneering teenagers, but in the low-wage waitress who had dared to show him what a real protector looked like. Her quiet courage had been a mirror, and he had hated the reflection so much he had smashed it. The memory of Lily's diorama returned to him, the single perfect glistening drop of glue on the doll's cheek, a tear he had caused. It was a piece of evidence more damning than the video footage. It was a dispatch from the silent, isolated world his daughter inhabited, a world he had never bothered to learn the language of. He had provided her with the best schools, the best therapists, the best material possessions, all while failing to give her the one thing she needed, a father who could see her. His entire life had been a series of strategic acquisitions, of identifying a target and relentlessly pursuing it until it was his. He looked at the paused image of Clara. He had misidentified the target. The prize wasn't a company or a market share. It was his daughter's heart. And this young woman, this nursing student he had dismissed as a nuisance, was somehow the key. He wasn't just going to fix this. He was going to mount a takeover of his own soul. His head of security, Thompson, had Clara Evans's details on his desk by 7 a.m. The file painted a picture of quiet, relentless struggle that made Alistair's stomach clench. Orphaned at 15, a series of foster homes, full academic scholarships, 2, sometimes 3, part-time jobs at a time. This wasn't just a job he had cost her. It was a rung on a ladder she had been painstakingly building for herself, splinter by bloody splinter. He didn't send a car. He didn't send an assistant. He drove himself, the sleek, silent power of his Tesla feeling like a vulgar intrusion in the gritty, determined neighborhood where Clara lived. He found her building and climbed the 4 flights of stairs, his bespoke Italian shoes silent on the worn-out runner. Each step felt like a penance. When he knocked and the door opened on its chain to reveal her tired, hostile eyes, he knew this would be the most difficult negotiation of his life. His usual weapons, power, money, intimidation, were not only useless here, they were the very source of the problem. "Please," he said, the word raw in his throat when she tried to close the door. "I am not here to excuse what I did. I am here to be held accountable for it." He saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes. It was a language she understood. I watched the footage. I saw everything. You were not an overstepping waitress. You were the only adult in that room. I was a coward. When she finally unlatched the chain and let him in, the Spartan neatness of her apartment, the sheer academic density of it struck him dumb. It was a shrine to a purpose, and he had desecrated it. He remained standing, a giant in her small world. He did not offer money, not at first. He offered the one thing he had never given anyone, a full and unconditional admission of his own inadequacy. "This is not about the job," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual boardroom authority. "This is about my daughter. You saw her. In 90 seconds, you understood a truth about her that I have managed to ignore for 8 years. She is drifting away from me. No, that's not right. I was never there to begin with. I don't know the way to her, Miss Evans. I think you do. I am asking you, not as an employer, but as a desperate father, to please show me the way." The raw, unvarnished plea hung in the air, a shocking confession from a man like him. He watched her process it, the fury in her eyes slowly giving way to a nurse's cool diagnostic assessment. She was seeing past the billionaire and identifying the pathology. "What you are asking for is not a simple fix," she said finally, her voice steady. "It's a complete deconstruction of the way you operate. It will be painful and it will be slow, and you will hate most of it. Are you prepared for that?" "I am," he said, with more certainty than he had felt about anything in his life. "Then we have conditions," she said, crossing her arms. A new power dynamic was being forged in that tiny room. 4 of them, non-negotiable. He nodded. "Name them." "First, my professional record. You will personally meet with Monsieur Dubois. You will explain that I was terminated due to your error in judgment, and that my record is to be amended to reflect a resignation in good standing with a letter of highest recommendation signed by you. My reputation is not a casualty of your education." "It will be done this morning," he confirmed. "Second, this is not a nanny position. I am not a buffer between you and your child. I will not raise her for you. My role is to be a translator, a guide. I will give you the tools and the knowledge. You and only you will do the work. The hours will be grueling, and they will be on your time, not hers." "I understand." "Third," she continued, her gaze sharpening, "the thorns. This is not about revenge. This is for Lily. She needs to see, unequivocally, that there are consequences for cruelty, that the world does not simply bend to the will of the wealthy and the loud. You will leverage your power not to close a deal, but to enforce a moral lesson. You will arrange for their daughter to apologize to Lily. It will be sincere, and it will be on our terms." This was the test, the crucible. It required him to weaponize his influence against his own kind, to sacrifice capital for character. He thought of the tiny doll with the tear on its face. "Consider it done." "And fourth," Clara said, her voice softening slightly, but losing none of its steel, "you will hire a professional therapist, for you. I am a student of pediatric nursing, Mr. Finch, not a psychologist specializing in whatever complex trauma led you to become the man you were last night. I can help you build a bridge to your daughter, but you have a wreckage of your own to sort through. You need a different kind of engineer for that." The final condition was a masterstroke of professional boundary setting. It was also, he knew, profoundly right. He had spent his life optimizing systems. He had never once stopped to examine his own corrupted operating code. "Agreed," he said. "All 4 conditions. When can we start?" Clara looked around her small apartment at the life he had almost destroyed. "We already have." The re-education of Alistair Finch was a brutal affair. Clara began not with Lily, but with him. She made him sit in Lily's room, alone, for 1 hour every evening. No phone, no laptop, no distractions. Just sit. At first it was maddening. The silence was a void he tried to fill with mental deal flows and market projections. But slowly the room began to speak to him. He noticed the texture of the soft blanket on her bed. He saw the specific shade of blue she favored in her drawings. He observed the way she arranged her few stuffed animals, not in a cuddly pile, but in a precise, geometric formation. He was learning to see the order in her world. Clara made him read, not business journals, but clinical studies on sensory integration, articles on the neurodiversity movement, first-hand accounts from nonverbal autistic adults. The words were dense, the concepts foreign. He was a novice, a freshman, humbled by a world of knowledge he hadn't known existed. He learned that the expensive wool coat he'd bought her wasn't a gift, but an instrument of torture against her hypersensitive skin. He learned that the sudden clang of a dropped fork could feel like a physical blow to her nervous system. He learned that her silence wasn't emptiness. It was a filtration system, struggling to cope with a world that was too loud, too bright, too much. The first session with Lily was a disaster. He tried to apply his new knowledge like a formula, kneeling down and speaking in the calm, measured tone Clara had demonstrated. "Lily, I see you are arranging your blocks. The red block is next to the blue block. This is a very orderly pattern." Lily froze, then stood up and walked out of the room, leaving him kneeling amidst her toys like a fool. In their debrief, Clara was blunt. "You sounded like a robot narrating a documentary. She doesn't need a narrator, Mr. Finch. She needs a father. Stop performing. Just be present." The next day he tried again. He sat on the floor, not speaking, simply watching her. She ignored him for 20 minutes. Then she picked up a small, smooth gray stone from a collection on her shelf. She held it for a moment, then crawled over and placed it in his open palm. His first instinct was to analyze, to ask, "What is this for?" But he remembered Clara's words. He simply closed his hand around the stone. It was cool and solid. He met Lily's eyes and gave a single, slow nod. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of Lily's mouth before she turned back to her toys. It felt like watching the sun rise. The confrontation with Marcus Thorne was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. Alistair walked into the familiar glass and steel tower, feeling like a different man. The old Alistair would have seen this as a strategic risk-benefit analysis. The new Alistair saw it as a sacred duty. "Alistair," Marcus boomed, all false bonhomie, "forget that whole restaurant thing. Kids will be kids. Now about the acquisition." "The acquisition is off the table, Marcus," Alistair said, his voice calm and final. He watched the greed curdle into confusion on Thorne's face. "We're not here to talk business. We're here to talk about character. Your daughter, in a deliberate and sustained act, bullied my daughter, a child with profound sensory processing challenges. You witnessed it, you permitted it, and you allowed your family to celebrate the dismissal of the one person who intervened. This is not about kids being kids. This is about a culture of cruelty that you as a father are actively cultivating." Thorne scoffed. "You're throwing away a $10 billion deal over a schoolyard tiff? I am establishing the values by which my family, and by extension my company, will operate." Alistair corrected him. "And those values do not include a partnership with anyone who mistakes cruelty for strength. This is what is going to happen. You and your wife and your daughter Madison will come to my home. Madison will apologize to Lily. She will not offer excuses. She will state what she did and why it was wrong. And you will sit there and bear witness to it. This is for my daughter's benefit, but it is also for yours. It is perhaps the last chance you have to teach your own child empathy before it's too late." He stood to leave. "My assistant will call to arrange a time. It's not a request." Walking out of that building, leaving a trail of scorched earth financial consequences behind him, Alistair didn't feel light. He felt solid. He had traded a piece of his empire for a piece of his soul, and it was the best deal he had ever made. 3 months later, the silence in the Ethelgard dining room was a different entity altogether. It was not the profound, absorbent silence of a child's fortress, but the hushed, respectful silence of an audience. Alistair Finch sat at the same table. Across from him, Lily was not arranging her silverware. She was drawing in a sketchbook, her brow furrowed in concentration. Clara sat beside Lily, no longer an invisible waitress, but an honored guest. Her tuition for the entire nursing program was in an escrow account, a salary and a scholarship all in one. But her presence tonight was not transactional. She had become a part of their fragile, evolving family. Lily finished her drawing. She looked at it, then slid the sketchbook across the table to her father. Alistair picked it up. It was a drawing of 3 people sitting at a restaurant table. A man, a young woman, and a small girl. They weren't speaking. They were all looking at each other, and from each of their mouths was a speech bubble. But the bubbles weren't filled with words. They were filled with pictures. The man's bubble contained a cool gray stone. The woman's held a perfectly rendered maple leaf, and the little girl's bubble contained a single, intricate, shining star. Alistair felt a familiar tightening in his throat, but it was not from shame or anger. It was a feeling of overwhelming, heart-cracking grace. He looked at his daughter, his beautiful, brilliant daughter, who had drawn him a picture of their new language. He reached across the table, his hand open. Lily looked at him, then at Clara, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. Slowly, Lily reached out and placed her small hand in his. Her touch was light, tentative, but it was there. It was real. Alistair held his daughter's hand, the quiet weight of it more valuable than anything he had ever owned. He looked across the opulent room, a map not of power, but of a long and difficult journey. He had not conquered this world. He had simply finally learned to be quiet enough to live within it, guided by the silent, steady light of his daughter's star.